Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar. Today, we are excited to welcome Carli Briscoe, who's going to be talking to us about trans youth and affirming and caring for them from a therapist perspective. So I'm very excited to have that perspective with us today. We are recording so that folks who registered but weren't able to attend can view this later. And the slide deck will be available after the presentation. You'll get an email with the slide deck and the recording if you want to go back and look at those. So with that, I will turn it over to Carli.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am Carli Briscoe. I am a therapist by trade. I've been working with the trans community and trans youth for many years now through practicum internship in school and then now working in private practice. Today, I do want to talk about trans youth and understanding like gender, identity, support, and best practices. We'll get started with the gender unicorn. I think a lot of people are familiar with this graphic, some aren't. It is an infographic that was designed by Landon Pan and Anna Moore for the Trans Student Educational Resources website. The idea behind using the unicorn symbol is that each individual person is unique and valuable, and it takes away some of the overwhelming experience of learning about gender identity, expression, sex, and then romantic and physical attraction. We're really going to just focus on the gender identity, expression, and sex aspects of this today. So getting started with gender identity when we're talking about sex versus gender. Sex is this classification of an individual at birth as male, female, or intersex, usually done by doctors, and that is usually placed on our birth certificate. It is the assignment at birth that is typically based solely on our external genitals, not considering any other characteristics as far as internal organs or chromosomes, anything like that. Someone's sex characteristics are their personal information, and we don't need to know someone else's sex assigned at birth to be respectful of their gender identity. When someone shares their identity, it's inappropriate to assume that that person's sex assigned at birth matches that gender identity. When we're talking about gender, that is our internal understanding and experiences of our own gender identity. Again, each person's identity is unique and personal to them, and we can never know someone's gender just by looking at them. When we talk about different genders, those include cisgender, which a lot of us are familiar with, which are people whose gender identity align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. When we talk about transgender individuals, these are people whose gender identity differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And many of those individuals do transition to align their gender expression with their gender identity. We also have non-binary individuals who experience their gender identity outside of our binary constructs. And then we also talk about two-spirit identities, which are solely for use for First Nations, Native American, and Indigenous individuals who operate outside of our colonial binary constructs. When discussing gender expression versus perception, our expression is the way that we present ourselves out in the world, which can include our physical appearance, our grooming, clothing, hairstyles, and our behaviors. These are all things that we have control over when it comes to elements of gender expression. We can express ourselves also through behaviors, body modification, and ornamentation. It can be a fun, creative, and affirming way to express our gender identities. When discussing gender perception, this is something that is outside of our control. It is the perceived gender that other people have based on how we present ourselves. We can't control how someone views us or sees us, and they can make their own assumptions based on a variety of visual and social cues that includes our gender expression and secondary sex characteristics, among others. For some trans individuals, The difference between the gender that they are thought to be at birth and their gender identity can lead to serious emotional distress that affects their health and everyday lives if it's not addressed. Gender dysphoria is the medical diagnosis that we give to individuals who experience this distress. Not all trans individuals experience gender dysphoria. It is my experience that the large majority do deal with some level of gender dysphoria, whether that be mild, moderate, even severe, but not all do experience it. Some don't deal with the anxiety and stress that comes with gender identity and expression, and that is okay and normalized as well. Gender dysphoria can often be relieved by allowing people to express their gender in a way that feels comfortable and true to themselves, which can be, including letting them dress how they would like to present themselves, how they like to use their chosen names and pronouns. And for some, that includes medically transitioning through hormones, through different medical procedures, both or none. These ideas help trans individuals live according to their gender identity, and that helps with mental well-being and physical well-being in many areas as well. It's really important to remember that being trans and having a transgender identity is in of itself not a medical diagnosable illness. Many transgender individuals live in a society that tells them that their identity is wrong or deviant or negative in some way. Many transgender individuals have lost support of families. They may lose their jobs and experience harassment and even violence a lot of times. Trans children specifically experience rejection and emotional and physical abuse, whether it be at home, at school, in their communities. They're definitely at a greater risk. These kinds of experiences can be challenging for anyone, and it can lead to anxiety disorders, depression disorders, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, self-harm. So many other mental illnesses are associated with having a transgender identity. Many trans people, especially people who are accepted and valued within their homes and in their communities, have the ability to live happy and fulfilling lives. They just need us to support them. Statistics for trans youth, we're going to focus specifically on the amount of youth that now identify as transgender. As of 2019, there was a study conducted through the Youth Risk Behavior Questionnaire that has found that 1.8% of youth identify as transgender, which is about 1.3 million youth in between the ages of 0 and 17. This is double the previously thought estimates of 0.7%. This data represents the largest ever federal effort to capture youth transgender identity, and it was through surveying youth, over 118,000 high school students across 10 states and 9 large urban school districts. They were asked the question, some people describe themselves as transgender when their sex at birth does not match the way that they think or feel about their own gender, and asks, are you transgender? Through that explanation, it gives them the option to either say, yes, I am trans, no, I am not, or I am not sure. The data that's represented here is only for those youth who marked either yes, I am, or no, I am not transgender. Those who marked not sure were not included in this data. Along with this data, we discussed the depression and suicide rates among trans youth and individuals. Trans youth do report a significantly increased rate of depression, suicidality, and victimization compared to their cisgender peers. Notably, in the past year, 1 in 3 trans youth reports attempting suicide, almost a third report being a victim of some type of sexual violence, and more than half reported at least 1 2-week period in the past year with depressive symptoms. We can see here that in almost every area, the risk for transgender youth is about triple what it is for their cisgender peers when looking at things such as feeling unsafe at school, being threatened or injured with a weapon at school, experiencing sexual violence. Again, with the really marked increase of suicidality thoughts, self-harm, and depression. With trans youth and Alabama law right now, we have a lot of kind of hot topics that have been going on for the past several years. In the past, just last year and then this year alone, there have been legislations that have come up. The most recent for last year was actually signed by Governor Kay Ivey, outlawing access to puberty blockers, hormone treatments, and surgeries. And it requires school personnel to out trans students to their parents and legal guardians, which we know can be incredibly dangerous and put our youth at significant risks. Other bills that have been advanced include blocking trans students from playing in public sports that align with their gender identity, and banning transgender youth from using bathrooms that align with their gender identity. The Human Rights Campaign Alabama State Director Kamarion Anderson Harvey quoted that denying best practice medical care and support to trans youth can have life-threatening consequences and is morally wrong. Delaying and denying healthcare have shown to contribute to depression, social isolation, self-hatred, risk of self-harm, and suicidal behavior, as well as more negative impacts. The passage of these legislations greatly restrict critically important care that trans youth need to thrive, as well as access best practice, age-appropriate, evidence-based, gender-affirming healthcare. Healthcare decisions should be made just between a family, their youth, and their healthcare team. Our legislative process should have no impact in those decisions, but unfortunately, it is becoming more and more common to hear these types of bills come up for vote. The bill makes some of these bills can make it a Class C felony for medical providers to provide gender-affirming care, facing up to 10 years in prison and a $15,000 fine. It also asks doctors to violate existing standards of medical care that are endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and pretty much every other leading medical authority and board advocates for this care for trans youth that is deemed medically necessary.
Carli, I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
So just going back to the legislation, and I know there are a lot that are on the docket this legislative session that we're kind of keeping an eye on. We don't lobby, but we do have a statement in support of trans youth and gender affirming care as an organization. So if the doctors' organizations, the medical organizations are against this and it goes against their sort of oath as health professionals, how is that reconciled with the law? Do they, because I know, they have an oath. I know social workers, have their oath, and how do you know how they're reconciling that, or how they'll continue to help those youth?
Yeah, and that's been a question that has come up several times so this is what these laws say, but how much can these laws actually dictate and govern how medical professionals do their jobs, within the scope of the Hippocratic Oath, and just what is actually the legal ramifications for doctors who provide this care. And I don't think that is a question that has been fully answered because it is still so ongoing.
Okay.
I know the doctor that we were speaking about earlier, Dr. Izzy Lowell, they threatened to revoke her medical practice here in Alabama, even though she's not based here, but that was actually never completed.
Okay.
Again, I think it's coming back up as almost like a threat, but
Mm-hmm.
by and large, these laws have not greatly impacted practitioners yet. So I think that's still an ongoing question.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, as far as I know. So when we discuss supporting our transgender youth that we have, whether in schools or just any contact with, we talk mainly about family acceptance and supporting trans youth in schools in ways such as using appropriate names and pronouns and other supportive factors. When we talk about family support and acceptance, there's been research that shows that trans youth who have supportive families show a 52% decrease in recent suicidal thoughts and a 46% decrease in suicide attempts. There's also a significant increase in overall self-esteem and general health. But unfortunately, only 27% of trans youth say that their families are supportive. So that leads us to understand that almost 75% of families don't support their trans children. When families do support their trans children, those children again show marked decreases in suicidality and attempts, as well as lower rates of depression and anxiety and increased levels of self-esteem and physical and mental health. Ways that family can show support and acceptance include respecting their children's chosen name and pronouns, allowing them to choose the clothes that they wear and the hairstyles that they choose and any type of gender expression, and also allowing them to choose their own toys and activities and extracurriculars that align with their gender identities. These tactics helps children know that there are adults who love them and support them unconditionally, especially when they experience really negative impacts and reactions outside of the family home. When discussing trans youth in schools, unfortunately, again, the majority of trans individuals do suffer from a lot of negativity and not being supported in schools and communities. Only 9% of trans individuals say their communities are accepting and supporting, and only 8% of trans youth are comfortable in their place of worship. 80% of trans students say they avoid school and activities due to some of these concerns. 64% of transgender students avoid gym class. 56% of students have been required to use bathrooms that don't align with their gender identity, and only 12% of trans youth say that their schools and communities have official policies to support their gender identities. Ways that trans youth can be supported in schools are by teachers and staff modeling inclusive behavior and speech, including respect and chosen names and pronouns, as well as incorporating age-appropriate representation of LGBTQ individuals into their curriculum, including history and other topics. Schools can ensure trans kids have the ability and the opportunities to participate in school activities and sports teams that align with their gender identity. Gender and Sexuality Alliances, or GSAs, and similar community organizations can support LGBTQ youth on a more peer-to-peer level and help reduce the impacts and the prevalence of bullying when it comes to LGBTQ youth. And libraries can include books and resources for all ages that represent trans and gender diverse youth and people, just given that exposure and normalizing these identities. Names and pronouns. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to mention, you had talked about a couple slides back, families and support, and the low amount of young people who reported that their families would be supportive. And I heard a story recently. It was a personal story, and I can't recall where I heard it, but the person had never, so they wouldn't come out as trans to their family, and the family had always been like very progressive and was very affirming of lesbian and gay and bisexual individuals, but they didn't know that their parent would be affirming or supportive of them as a trans person. And it wasn't until the parent said something about some active legislation or something that indicated to the child that they would be supportive, that they came out. And so I think all that to say that another way that families can be safe for their children is to let them know that they do support whoever they want to be, not just whoever they may love someday, but also who they may want to be or feel that they are, as male or female or non-binary. Just sometimes you have to be explicit with young people so that they know exactly what you mean, so that they can feel safe. So I just thought that was an interesting anecdote from this individual who was speaking.
Definitely. And I've run across that in practice where, so a lot of times the practice I work out is sought out for our, the way that we work with this very niche population. So parents may have an idea, but their youth may not have come out yet. And I think there is something to being more specific instead of just kind of generalizing, telling our kids they can be whoever they want to be and love whoever they want to love, is just having that more generalizing and, just normalizing conversations about what that looks like in every context, whether it be, again, romantically, identity, not just where we say, oh, you can be whoever you want to be as far as career and anything else like that goes, is being more specific and having those open conversations. And that's where that exposure and normalization can really help in those areas with those youth, at home first and in the communities. So respecting the language that youth choose to use as far as their identity goes, whether that's gender identity, sexual identity, anything like that, it can be life-saving and life-changing for a lot of our youth. In a recent study of transgender youth, using chosen names and pronouns at home, at work, with friends, in school, has also helped reduce depressive symptoms, suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior, as well as self-harm. When we talk about names can seem very gendered, where we usually think about like Tom and John, and then we have Sarah and Sally, and these very gender binary feeling names. Some trans and non-binary individuals are very uncomfortable with a binary associated name, so they choose new names or a variation of their old name that feels more comfortable and aligns more closely with their gender identity. The process of changing names legally can be very expensive and complicated, and many people don't have access to those resources, especially as youth. So we can just work together as supportive community to just affirm them in ways by just respecting their chosen names and pronouns. Pronouns including she, her, he, him, they, them, when we're talking about possessive pronouns, all of those kind of ideas. We can't assume someone's gender. We also can't assume someone's pronouns and their names. It's always best to confirm with an individual, either just asking them, what is your name and pronouns, or introducing ourselves in that way. So I'm Carli, my pronouns are she, her. It's nice to meet you. What is your name? What are your pronouns? Meeting them kind of halfway there to open up that honest and affirming environment for them. When talking about honorifics, we usually associate Mr., Miss, and Mrs. as just the general honorifics that are used. Lately, in the past few years, a lot of talk has come up for a new honorific for those who are trans and non-binary who don't operate under one of our binary options. And that is a new honorific mix, and it's MX. And we also can't, again, assume someone's honorific. And it is okay to just ask. I think a lot of people are more appreciative that we ask versus offended in any way. They would rather be addressed how they choose to be, and asking them is totally okay. When we're talking about clinical considerations, the field of transgender healthcare is rapidly changing and evolving. In the last few years, there has been this unprecedented global kind of explosion of visibility of transgender and gender diverse individuals who are seeking supportive and gender affirming medical treatments, including physical health care, mental health care, and psychological health care. At the same time, there's a growing expansion of transgender healthcare services, as well as a lot of new scientific literature that is coming out in this area. In 1979, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health was established, and they produced standards of care that were published. They have been revised 7 times, and the board is currently working on an 8th revision for these standards of care that should be due out this year. They hope to establish healthcare individual support and guidance to provide healthcare professionals, assistant with transgender and gender diverse people, giving them safe pathways to achieve lasting personal comfort with their gender identity and their gendered selves to maximize, again, overall health care, which includes psychological well-being. We've got primary care, gynecological and urological care, reproductive options, voice and communication therapies, mental health services, as well as hormonal and surgical treatments that are best practice services, among many others. When looking at a counselor's perspective, we as counselors are bound to ethical standards, including not imposing our personal values, beliefs, or opinions onto our clients, as well as not operating beyond our own knowledge, training, and capabilities. In Alabama, there is a shortage of mental health practitioners who are knowledgeable and educated in LGBTQ, especially transgender care. I believe that is starting to change through COVID and through the expansion of telehealth services. Our private practice specifically has blown wide open. We serve clients literally from the top of the state all the way down to the panhandle, whether it's fully telehealth, whether it's a hybrid of coming into the office and having sessions as well as telehealth sessions. But we are honored to be able to provide educated and supportive care to our transgender youth. And we are also actively working with other practitioners to provide further education and knowledge and understanding to be supportive with our trans youth and what that looks like for them as far as mental health care. We're going into talking about best practices when working with our transgender youth population. We're going to discuss things such as disclosure, transitioning, age, binary and non-binary genders, sexuality, passing as a transgender specific term, misgendering, and then microaggressions. When we're discussing disclosure, we're talking about when our youth are coming out to us. It's really important for us to be supportive, but not ask a lot of questions or rush into conversations that our youth aren't ready to talk about or to have. We don't want to force those conversations. It's really just about giving them the space and allowing them to come to us when they're ready. When a friend or a loved one or a student or youth of any sort shares their experience and their gender identity with us, we may, in a very supportive mindset, want to share that information with fellow staff, with friends and family to be supportive, coming from a good place. But it's really vital that we don't out or share their stories before they're ready. It can cause issues with safety, with, again, more mental health issues than maybe they're ready to deal with. It could compromise their safety and place them in dangerous situations when they're in environments or in a society that is not safe and not welcoming for our transgender youth and individuals. Transitioning looks different for each individual, and there's no right way for someone to transition or express their gender. Some trans individuals decide to medically transition and others don't. This can be related to personal expression, lack of gender affirming care, medical conditions that could prohibit them from attaining certain procedures or even access to puberty blockers or hormone replacement therapy. And it's more complicated than just medical transitioning and can take place over a number of years. There's no like time frame for transitioning if that's what someone chooses to do personally. Under no circumstances should we ever ask any unprompted questions of our trans youth concerning their bodies, their genitals, their medical history, plans for future surgeries or medical procedures, ask them about their dead name, or even ask them invasive details about their life prior to transition. We would be really uncomfortable if people asked us those kind of questions, and equally so. This is not something that we want to bring up and discuss with our trans youth, and can be more harmful than helpful. When we talk about age with transgender individuals and transitioning, there's really no right age to understand our own gender and identity. Some individuals know their gender from a very young age. I think a lot of cisgender individuals fall into this category, but there are many trans individuals who know from a young age what their gender identity is, and we can support them. And by supporting them, it has positive effects on overall mental health and well-being throughout their life. Other people transition later in life, some in adolescence, some in early adulthood, some later in life. I've worked with clients that are in their 60s and 70s who are just now coming into their gender identity and their trans identity as well. So a lot of the time frame around coming out and understanding their gender identity is affected by being in accepting environments and having a good support system and having access to social, medical, and legal resources that support them and help them along their journey and their own gender identity questions and support. Other people explore gender identity over the course of their entire lives. Like I was just saying, there's just no right or wrong time frame, and it's easy for us to just be supportive and let people express themselves and explore themselves in their own times. Binary and non-binary genders, when we talk about gender, we look often at this binary perspective of male and female. But for us, we like to consider gender as more of a continuum or a spectrum, and not everyone, even though the majority do fall on the binary. There's many who don't. Others express through non-binary, gender fluid, and there's many other gender identities out there right now. Non-binary people often prefer to identify outside of those binary categories of gender and usually kind of fall somewhere on that spectrum. And with gender fluid, it's kind of more like what it sounds, is people are able to adjust up and down that spectrum, even day to day, sometimes through different stages of their lives. And they just want to be accepted and supported for who they are day to day and in their own gender expression and identity. Sexuality is often confused and can be lumped in with gender identity, but trans and non-binary people often identify with a wide variety of sexualities, just like their cisgender counterparts. Just because we know someone's gender and gender identity does not mean that we automatically know what their sexual orientation is. Again, often they're lumped together, and this is an area that we see a lot of parents and other supportive allies have trouble distinguishing between. Someone's gender identity is, again, their gender expression and how they feel, whereas their sexual identity and orientation involves their romantic attractions and physical attractions. So very different ideas and topics. The term passing is used to describe whether or not a person is perceived as a certain gender. For example, we'll say like a trans woman passes as a woman, or a trans man passes as a man. For many trans individuals, passing is the goal that allows them to present themselves and be seen as the gender that they identify with. And it can be a real important sense for them as far as well-being. And it provides what we call passing privilege, which can allow them to move more safely through society and through their environments when they're perceived as the gender that they identify with, especially when being transgender can be a dangerous thing for that person. This term can actually be kind of problematic because it implies that being perceived as cisgender is the ultimate goal for transgender individuals and non-binary people. The word passing can imply that a person has to convince others of their gender and gender identity, rather than simply just being able to express their gender identity and who they are as just their true self. It can imply that transgender people are lying, tricking, or deceiving other people into believing that they're a certain gender, when that is not the case at all. A lot of transgender individuals just want to live their truth in their life, however they decide to express that. So passing sounds, okay, I see a question in here. Yeah, blending. That is more progressive term for this. And I think this is the idea that a lot of people are trying to work towards, is not having to assimilate, either being seen as one of the binaries, but just somewhere in the middle, if that makes sense. Okay. Misgendering is to misgender someone means to use the wrong names, wrong pronouns, or wrong honorifics, any form of address that we use to gender someone. Whether misgendering happens innocently as a true mistake, or even a malicious attempt to invalidate someone, it's very hurtful for the person on the receiving end of that, and can even, again, put them at risk for their safety if they're outed in very unsupportive environments. Purposely misgendering is, of course, never okay. And we can be good allies for our trans youth by standing up, speaking up when we see someone who's being harassed for their gender and gender expression. If we misgender someone by accident, and it happens, we all make mistakes, it's best to just apologize quickly, not make a big fuss out of it. That can bring even more attention onto the person that we misgendered, create a lot of discomfort and nervousness for them. And we can show that we care by doing better as we move forward. So we don't want to overdo it when we're apologizing. Just apologize, correct yourself, and move forward.
Hey, Carli, I have a real quick question about the misgendering. So I have been in situations where I have correctly used someone's pronouns, and I'm with someone who has either been told and I'm sure has forgot, because, you know, I know that they are a person of good faith, you know, they would never intentionally harm someone, but they've forgotten, or, you know, been in sort of a public speaking situation where that's happening, where I'm using the correct pronoun and the other person isn't. And so how, I don't know if you have any advice for this, but how to deal with that, because I feel in the moment, especially in like a public setting, to call that person out, would never want to call that person out and make them feel, because then it would just become a whole thing, right? But how could I guess I could go up to that person after the fact, but then the harm has already been caused. I guess what I've struggled with lately is when I'm in a public speaking situation and the person I'm speaking, you know, who's my co-speaker, is using the incorrect pronouns for someone, how to manage that. Because I notice immediately, I'm like, oh, crap.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, that person on the receiving end of that, like, they notice it too. And some are very comfortable with, like, it's okay, people mess up, and some get very flustered and upset by that, even if they can't express it in that moment. So I try to just, like, discreetly correct that, you know, the person who is using the wrong pronouns, if it's possible. And sometimes it's not, and it does just have to be dealt with after the fact. I know with a lot of my youth, where I can get caught up with is if I have to have some interaction with a parent. So for me, with our youth, I try to have the discussion with them, like, if I'm talking with your parent about you, or you know, something, how do you want me to address you to them? And it's just being very intentional and very careful with language, especially if youth, like, aren't out to their family, is so we all kind of know what this game plan looks like for their protection and their ultimate comfortability. I know it's kind of a little bit of two different answers, but that's how I've handled it in the past, because a lot of times they're there is no really good way in like a situation like you're saying, if it's
Right.
especially in a very public arena, how to address that. I think we just continue to use the correct pronouns and maybe hope that they catch that error and catch up. But
Right.
unfortunately, sometimes we're just going to be in those situations where that doesn't happen.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, when talking about microaggressions, we talk about microaggressions in many arenas and aspects and with many populations. Microaggressions are everyday comments and questions that can be hurtful and stigmatizing to marginalized people and groups. Microaggressions are usually subtle, and the person committing them often aren't coming from any negative or unsupportive background. They may have no idea that the things that they're saying are harmful and hurtful. For example, a comment that a lot of transgender individuals hear is, "Oh, you don't look trans." And it's often, again, coming from a very supportive background as a compliment, but it implies that being transgender is a negative thing overall, or it can, and that all people want to be perceived as cisgender, which again isn't the case. Since microaggressions are subtle and they come from our own learned biases, what we can do is just do our best to listen to any feedback that we receive from our trans youth and non-binary youth. If someone's feelings are hurt, then we need to validate and affirm that, and take the time to listen to what they're saying, understand what they're saying, and learn from that experience. Again, we all do make the mistakes, but it's how we move forward after the mistakes are made that really matter. On that topic of making these mistakes and then apologizing, while we rarely intend to hurt other people's feelings, especially as people who want to be supportive, we can make those common mistakes, such as forgetting someone's name and pronouns, accidentally dead naming one of our youth, or any type of misgendering that can hurt our youth's feelings and even, again, put them at a safety risk, because a lot of this comes down to safety in our environments and is an outing, intentionally or unintentionally, our trans youth. So we got to listen, be accountable, and then commit to do better. Unfortunately, it's very common to avoid listening to those people when they're trying to express that they're hurt, whether it was intentional on our part or not, as it makes us feel uncomfortable. It brings feelings of guilt, of shame, and it can even create defensiveness in us because we know that that wasn't our intention. But it's really important that we sit in that discomfort. That is being accountable for our mistake there. Be willing to listen to their feedback and what they are saying to us and how it was hurtful to them, because this is how we grow and learn to do better. We need to seek to understand and empathize with our youth's personal and their lived experiences. Being accountable, taking responsibility for our actions, being aware of our privileges and experiences that we have had that contribute to our biases is super important. Don't dismiss when the person is sharing with us. We don't want to ever dismiss our youth. We don't want to ever justify our behaviors or defend our intentions, again, because we know we're trying to come from a good place more often than not. It's not helpful to them. It belittles and invalidates our youth or other individuals, and it shifts the focus away from the individuals who have been harmed or who are feeling hurt by what happened onto, again, our personal feelings of guilt, shame, and defensiveness. Remembering that intention is not impact, and intention does not mean action and follow-up. The best apologies are ones that don't make excuses or invalidate someone else's feelings. And then we just commit to doing better with our youth and other individuals. Treat mistakes as learning experiences. The most authentic apologies that we can give are meaningless if there's no change for the behavior, or if the behavior continues to be repeated in the future. The best way that we can show that we care about our trans youth and are supportive is recognizing where we messed up and intentionally do better in the future. That is the majority of the presentation today. I'm really honored to be able to speak on something that is very near and dear to my heart, working with this population. We're going to send out this list of references and resources that help us as adults, educators, family members support our LGBTQ and especially transgender youth, just in the effort to reduce all of these negative risks that come with being inside that population and identifying with that population, because they're very easy adjustments that we can make to be supportive and honor those youth and their experiences and their identities. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. And I would like to open it up for any questions or any clarifications anyone would like to ask or bring up.
Thank you so much, Carli. While folks are thinking of their questions, I just, the thing about affirming and supporting trans youth that always gets me, especially when we see the anti-trans legislation that not only in Alabama, but across the country, especially across the South, is that oftentimes the same politicians who are pushing this anti-trans legislation in theory or seem to be very concerned about children, about the protection of children, about you know, it all seems to be bundled up in this, we care about children, we want to protect them sort of thing. And of course they're totally not caring about or protecting trans children, and they're not including trans children in that child population. But I mean, the thing is, even if you didn't support or didn't, affirm a trans person, I don't know how you can get around the statistics that you shared about the suicidality of trans individuals and the suicide attempts and the homelessness because their parents have kicked them out. And trans youth are at such a risk because of how they're treated, because of the lack of support. I don't understand how anyone can claim to be, pro-child or pro-protecting children and then put forward this legislation that, literally, and I don't say this hyperbolically, but like could kill trans children, could put them at even greater risk for death. And it's so frustrating for me to see that.
Yeah, and we go, again, it's against all scientific facts and statistics, to exclude them as part of the population and consideration. And this area of youth has been so politicized that, again, it's dictating so many things in the political arena as far as laws, and then individuals who want to be elected into offices, they are using this as a trigger topic for votes and for other considerations. And really, at the end of the day, it leaves these very vulnerable kids alone and suffering without support and help on these fronts. So it's imperative that we as allies speak up, use our voices as adults to fight and advocate for them. When these laws come up on the House floor and the Senate floor and such, there is, the showing of parents of trans kids and trans adults who are bringing their own experiences and the own harm that they've personally had or watched their children go through. And it's incredibly heartbreaking to see that be so dismissed in this whole process. And it just shows that they don't value the population like they say that they do.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to share just one thing, Carli, if I can share my screen. This was really helpful for me. Again, just thinking about the trans legislation. I'm going to stop your screen share and start this one. And I bring this up because I know there's a lot of confusion about what gender affirming care looks like. And this was really helpful for me. This is on Instagram, so I'm sorry I don't have it in a proper slide deck, but the Instagram handle is "This is what a feminist looks like," and this is actually a parent of a trans child, and she goes through and explained what exactly does gender affirming care look like at each age. So before puberty, it's basically the same healthcare that a cisgender child would have. There's no hormones blocked, no hormones given, no surgeries performed. So prior to puberty, these children are, their secondary sex characteristics haven't emerged yet. And so they are just treated the same as any child would be treated. And so then oftentimes families will focus on socially transitioning a lot of the things that you were talking about in terms of just affirming their gender, using the name that they prefer, their pronouns, changing clothing or haircuts, that kind of thing. They may meet with mental health professionals during this time to start working on what this might mean for the future. And then this is what I found so interesting. So at the onset of puberty, trans children can receive hormone blockers under the supervision of doctors, of course, but all it does is essentially a pause button. So it allows them to grow in other areas like their height and their weight, but it pauses the development of their secondary sex characteristics, which includes like breasts or Adam's apples. And it's completely reversible. Like you can stop taking hormone blockers and then hormones will begin to develop in those secondary sex characteristics. So this whole fear tactic of kids will change their minds or it's just a stage or, these horrible reasons that folks give for not giving young people this care is unfounded, because obviously here we see that it's reversible. And then it has very few side effects. She tells here how it's administered. And then teens around the age of 16 may, with the guidance of a team of medical professionals, they may qualify for hormone therapy, and that they may choose to do that. They may choose not to do that. And so then that gets into regular injections of estrogen or testosterone. I thought this was interesting too, that if a teenager comes out at 16 as trans, they do not immediately qualify for hormone therapy. So they can't just say, well, I'm 16 now and I'm trans and I want to go get hormone therapy. They actually, it's very difficult for them. They have to go through this time frame where they're being evaluated by a team, probably also by a therapist. It has to all be documented. So again, I just thought that was very interesting in terms of the fear tactics that we hear.
Absolutely.
And then the next step would be gender affirming surgery, possibly, again, if that person chooses, and that could only occur after the age of 18. So there are some instances where a face or chest surgery could be performed at the age or after the age of 16, but any sort of genitalia surgery wouldn't even be able to occur until 18. And so I guess I just thought that was, I thought she did a really good job of just explaining and demystifying, what does that care look like? Because I think that the anti-trans folks have amped up everybody to think that you can just go to the doctor's office and have a gender affirming surgery at the age of 12 and it's non-reversible. And then if you decide that you want to live your life as a different gender, then you're screwed. And that's not how it works at all. And it's very methodical and well thought out between the care team and the family and the individual. And so anyway, I just wanted to demystify that and take away that fear that I think that a lot of people have about what does gender affirming care even mean.
Yeah. And that there's a lot of that misinformation and lack of education. And like, I think they group the puberty blockers with the hormone replacement therapies, and they're two very, very different things. You're very right. In Alabama for a very long time, and some doctors are moving away from it a little bit, is to even receive hormone replacement therapy, not to mention going forward with any surgeries. You had to be evaluated by a mental health professional, and a lot of physicians require a letter from a mental health professional saying this person is free from any mental health illness, that would impair their judgment. And it's also, we hear that trope of changing your minds, but by and large, that happens extremely rarely.
Right.
And in the few instances that it does, the majority of those end up falling on that non-binary scale, because again, we don't talk about those options and those ideas enough either.
Right.
So there's a lot to be said for that.
Absolutely. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so our time here is unfortunately finished, but this has been such a good discussion. Definitely, I learned some things I haven't heard before, and I've been doing this work for a long time. So thank you so much for sharing with us. Thanks to everyone for being here. And like I said, the slide deck and the recording will be available to you all after this.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good one.